What I would usually do at the first class meeting of a class is I would take some time and show you the resources that I had put up in Moodle. But I arrived last week realizing I didn't have my Moodle login on my tablets at all, so I couldn't show it to you. So I want to start today by pointing out just a couple of things you might find useful. The glossary right now is not up to date. It will be soon. It's in Google Docs. It is terms that I am going to use in the class with a definition. And then on the right, and I'm not very confident of this, but I've picked Japanese terms that I think are close. So I hope that the Japanese version of some of the terms that I use doesn't wind up being confusing. If it does, if you think I picked a term that doesn't quite mean what I think it means, that would be a great thing for us to discuss in class. Back over to Moodle. Lecture recordings, I trust if you've been in Moodle, you've seen that already. Right underneath it, at the end of class today, the slides that I'm using today are going to become visible. They're in Google Slides, it's a link, so therefore, when you see words come up on the screen, write them down if writing down helps you pay attention. Some students say to me that it does. Write them down if that helps you learn while listening. But if you don't want to write them down, if you'd rather just listen and not take notes, you'll have the slides later, so that's possible. After today, you should be in pretty good shape to start thinking about the field report and the article report, because today I'm going to introduce you to a lot of terms and concepts that would help with those assignments. If you're the kind of person who likes working ahead, I've already mentioned that I'm not going to assign partners for the field report or the article report until some of the deadlines to add the class or drop the class have passed. Because when we do have partners, and then more people add, and some people drop, it just becomes a mess. But what you could do right now, you could go in Article Report to this folder that says Article Report Options. And you could, down here at the bottom, download the whole thing, and then read some of the abstracts of the articles to see what the studies were about. Your goal should be to pick maybe between 3 and 5 that you think sound really interesting, so that when you have a partner, you can say, these are the ones I like, you can find out which ones they like, and you might very quickly be able to decide and sign up for the one you're going to report on. I'm going to give you one tip for reading articles that are taken from peer-reviewed academic journals, just in case you've never done it before. The abstract will help at first. The abstract is on the first page of the article. So if I open this one up, it's not incredibly easy to see, but it starts right there, abstract, and it goes just through there. It is about a one-paragraph summary of everything that happens or everything they reported about their study. But over the years, I've had lots of students read an abstract and then later on realize they had misunderstood it. It didn't wind up being as interesting as they thought. So if you have a short list, if you have 3 to 5 that sound interesting, and you want to work even further ahead, here's my advice. In every one of those studies, there is a section, probably in the second half of the article, and it is labeled discussion. In the discussion section, the researchers will explain in pretty direct and plain language what the study was about and what they found. Now, that comes after a lot of other sections. There's an introduction, a review of literature, a methods section, a results section, and then you get to the discussion. What I do all the time when I am in a hurry and I have a new study that I want to read, I skip to the discussion and read it. Then I back up to the method and I read it. Then I generally read the conclusion. I read the introduction last of all. And the results section, I only pay any attention to the results section if I've read the rest of the study and I think they made a mistake. If you read the results section, you'll see that is where they talk a lot about what statistical methods they used, what kind of modeling technique they used. That's really of interest only to other professors. If you've ever been to the doctor for a health issue and they run tests on you and they then tell you what the raw test data showed. We examined your major histocompatibility complex with titration and we found 3 parts per billion. And all of it is just, they know what it means, but they record all of that information from those tests in case they need to send you to another doctor, maybe a specialist. And that other doctor could look at those test results and understand them. But to you, what they would say is, here's my diagnosis. Here's what I think is happening. And now here is my prescription. Here is what we're going to do about it. That's what researchers do in the discussion section. In the results section, they're talking to other professors. So that is my advice. If you want to work ahead on the article report, read abstracts to narrow down the list, and then maybe read the discussion section of the ones that you like to make sure they're really about what you think they're about. Okay, those are the things that I wanted to show you, would have shown you on the first day, but I did not have that available. The topic for today, we are going to define some elementary terms. We are going to get some concepts understood that will help us with all the specific areas we will get to starting next week, and especially the week after next. The first term to define is right in the name of the class, nonverbal communication. We will define it by first saying what verbal means. Verbal is very simple. Verbal communication just means communication using words, using language. It means the meanings of the words themselves, their dictionary definition. It means the grammar and the additional meaning that comes from that. Nonverbal communication, then, the simplest definition of it is any kind of communication that you carry out without using language. Now, one thing, it's easy to misunderstand. Nonverbal communication can happen, and usually does happen, at the same time as verbal communication. It doesn't have to mean verbal communication is not happening. A lot of the examples that I'm going to show you today, you'll see speech would be going on at the same time. But the particular delivery of the nonverbal content would not be in words. So what I want to do to elaborate on that definition, because that definition does not tell you very much. But there are what we sometimes call channels and sometimes call codes. People who do research in nonverbal communication group them into about 6 channels or codes. For each of them, for most of them, there are subcategories and examples, and I think that after we've talked about them, it's going to become clear, if you're not familiar with the term nonverbal communication, you're going to have a beginner's familiarity with it. Code or channel number 1 is appearance. Appearance. Appearance, first of all, can refer to what the English term researchers use is endowment. Endowment, and incidentally, the appearance code, we're going to, 2 weeks from now, the week after next, we're going to spend the whole class meeting on appearance, and we'll get to everything I'm saying here in much greater detail. This visual is my way to refer to endowment because I think the most striking thing for you to notice, he is a lot taller than she is. Height, how tall you are, is a really easy example of endowment because endowment is things about your body that it would be difficult or impossible to change. If you are short, there are surgeries that could make you an inch or two taller. If you are tall, there are horrible accidents that could happen that would make you shorter. But typically, how tall you are, how short you are, is not going to change. Now, you might be thinking, well, how does my height communicate? But when people observe you, they put an interpretation on that particular trait that you have. When we get to the day where we talk about power and dominance, one thing we will say throughout most of the world, and boy is it true in the United States, taller people, more powerful. Shorter people can be powerful, but they have to work hard at it. Height brings an impression that you're powerful. Now, that's not the only example of endowment. Eye color, the color of your eyes. Is it possible to change it? I guess. Probably not with anything safe or healthy. Your eye color typically is whatever it is. You have a lot of other physical traits that it would be very difficult to change. And those elements of your appearance, other people see them and they interpret who you are. Those traits tell people about your identity, what groups you belong to. Sometimes what they interpret may be accurate or not accurate, but they make those interpretations anyway. The other half of the appearance code refers to things that you wear or things that you do voluntarily to change your appearance. Now this has two categories in this one visual. There's clothing, hairstyle, makeup. Those all go in a category we call adornment. Adornment. Because you can change those quickly. The easy example is clothing. You can change your clothes anytime you want. Makeup, you can put it on, you can wash it off. Hairstyle, grab a comb and some gel, change your hairstyle. The other example, though, these piercings, I'm not sure, but I think those might be implants. These piercings, those are all what we call modification. Modification. They're not your endowment. They're not how tall or short you are. But they're also hard to change. Impossible to change quickly. One example of adornment is a hat. You can put a hat on your head, take a hat off your head. Jewelry is adornment. Put a ring on your finger, take a ring off your finger. If you get a tattoo, and a tattoo is modification. A tattoo can be removed very slowly, very painfully. If you have piercings, if you take the piercing out, it will heal up, but not within minutes like taking off a hat. So, endowment, adornment, modification. One more thing to say before we go on to code and channel number 2. Endowment is not usually about messages that you are deliberately trying to send. Tall people do not tend to walk around the world saying, I'm tall, I'm tall, I'm tall. But adornment, the clothes you put on, commonly are a conscious, deliberate attempt to send a message. Tattoos very often are. I would have to think hard to think of a tattoo that you would voluntarily get that was not a way of telling other people, or if it's hidden, maybe just telling yourself a message. So channel number 1, appearance. Channel number 2 is movement. Movement. The first example, or the first subcategory of the movement channel, is gesturing. Gestures are not words, but they communicate. So I mentioned a few minutes ago, nonverbals commonly happen at the same time as verbal communication. And this was the example I was thinking of. There's a whole area, mostly in the field of psychology, some in the field of communication. We gesture while speaking not only to help the listener understand, but we gesture to make the words come. Sometimes we can't think of the word that we want, and gesturing helps. Did you ever notice when you talk on the phone and nobody's around, you still gesture? And I have, in my classes before, we pick out the student who loves to talk with their hands, and we ask them to explain something or talk about something that they're interested in while sitting on their hands. And it's very, very hard. They can't think of the words they want. There are different kinds of gestures. This is a gesture we call an emblem. We call that an emblem because it translates directly to a word or a phrase. That gesture just means something like no, forbidden, stop, but it's specific. Again, we're going to have a whole day on this, but some of the other gestures are things like illustrators. If you were to say, I went out fishing and I caught a huge fish, and you show how big with your hands. Now, this does not necessarily always mean big. But when someone's listening carefully and they see that you drew a picture in the air with your hands, if I were to ask you to explain what a spiral staircase is, I think most of you, while explaining it, would do this with your hands. You would draw it in the air. So those are just 2 examples of gestures as nonverbals. The other category in the movement code or channel is posture and walk. Posture and walk. You can tell a lot of things by people's posture. When soldiers stand at attention and they stand up as straight as they can, they're showing respect for a superior officer. If you slouch, you may communicate nonverbally. You don't want to be there. You don't feel good. It may communicate disrespect. If you stand upright but relaxed, not slouching but not at attention, that's the kind of posture that is typical of people who are in authority. And I'll tell one quick story that you'll hear again on the day we spend the whole day on this channel. Years ago, there was something happening at the college where I taught, and I was upset about it. I don't even remember the details. But one of the employees at the university was talking with me about it. She was sitting at her desk, and I was standing over her like this, talking, very upset, very heated. And I noticed she was pushing back away from me a little bit. And I thought, oh, I see what I'm doing. And I grabbed a chair and I sat down. And now we were on eye level, looking at each other. I wasn't standing over her like this. And the conversation just went a lot better. That's about posture. When you loom over someone, it can seem aggressive or threatening, even if that's not what you intend. Now that's all posture, but in the picture he was walking. You can see a lot about people by the way that they walk. People can show by their walk that they feel confident. People can show they feel frightened. You can see that people, as with slouching, you might see that they're tired by their walk. There was a fascinating study published a few years ago, building on the idea that police officers have talked about for years. Some people, when they walk in a dangerous neighborhood, and in the United States there are lots of dangerous neighborhoods, the way that they walk makes them look like a victim. The way that they walk shows people who want to steal or want to commit other crimes, this person is an easy target. What this study did, it invited participants to first of all report, had they been a victim of a crime? Had someone mugged them, assaulted them? And after they reported that, it then put lights all over them and had them walk across a room. A video was made, and then their entire appearance was taken out of the video. All you could see in the video was the lights, so it showed what their walk looked like. And then a separate group of participants were asked, has this person been the victim of crime? And they were able to tell, just by the movement of the lights, who walked like a victim and who walked like they were confident, and you'd better leave them alone. So these are things you can communicate with your walk. Gestures, walk, posture, that's the movement code. Code number 3. Code number 3, we sometimes call the interaction code or the conversation code. It has 3 parts. First, there is facial expression. This is a set of photos made for a study done by Japanese researchers of what researchers around the world call the basic emotions. This is very controversial. People who say that there are basic emotions claim that these emotions are made the same way by people all over the world and recognized as meaning the same thing by people all over the world. Other researchers say it only looks like that because these researchers are making basic mistakes. We're going to have a day where we talk about this controversy. But in the meantime, this is part of the interaction code or the conversation code. Because when you have a conversation with someone and it's your turn to speak, they give you feedback by what happens on their face. Their emotions, their interest, their agreement or disagreement. Usually this is true when we're not all wearing masks. And there is a wave of research being done in this code. How much can we do while wearing masks to compensate and try to send these same messages? Now, the first element of the conversation code is facial expression. The second element is eye contact. Eye contact. When you have a conversation, the way people look at you, how often they look away, the quality of their eye contact, are they looking happy? Are they glaring? Do you find that as you're talking, they're actually looking around the room for other people? There are lots of messages sent in the middle of conversation with eye contact. The third and final element of the interaction or conversation code is voice. Now, this may be the best example of a nonverbal that happens at the same time as verbal communication. I used this as my visual. She's at a protest, and I imagined she's probably loud and her pitch is high. And you can tell things about what people are saying when they get louder and when their pitch goes up. But you could also, if I had a recording of whatever she's saying, but you couldn't see the visual, from her voice, I think you could tell that she's female. Female voices and male voices tend to sound very different. You probably could tell that she's not a child and not a teenager. Older people's voices tend to sound different from younger people's. It varies by language and part of the world, but usually we signal sarcasm with what we do with our voice. Often, we will signal jokes with what we do with our voice. And there is a goofy tone of voice or a playful tone of voice. And while we send most of our emotional messages with facial expression, we also send emotional messages with our voice. Scared voice, angry voice, sad voice. You may have had the experience where you have to call your parents because they want you to call them regularly. And they pick up the phone and you get one sentence into the phone call and they say, "What's wrong?" Because they can hear it in your voice. Face, eyes, and voice are the conversation code. The fourth code, I only have one visual for. Space and touch. Personal space and communicating with touch. We are going to talk extensively in here about a concept called nonverbal immediacy. Nonverbal immediacy. We tend to show whether we feel close to another person psychologically with our nonverbals. And the biggest nonverbal immediacy cue is to stand closer to someone. I teach a lot of people in the United States who are education majors. And one of the simplest tricks we talk about is anytime a student asks a question, as you are answering their question, walk toward them. Just a few steps. Not so close that you loom over them, but just approach them a little, and that's a nonverbal way to show them you appreciate the question. It was a good question. So closeness is an immediacy cue. Extreme closeness like that, signals that the relationship is intimate. We tend to get that close with romantic partners. That might be brother and sister. They might be very close friends. Family, friends, or someone you're dating or married to, if you get that close. Now, if you ride the train, you might get that close, But then what we tend to do, not make eye contact and try as hard as we can not to interact. Because when you're that close with a stranger, it's intrusive to actually look at them or really do anything that draws their attention, which is why so many people read or play on their phone on the train. Along with space, there's touch. We communicate with touch. A lot of the messages are positive. We communicate friendliness. We communicate affection, which is why parents tend to touch their children quite a bit. There's a whole lot of research that's been done over the years that a certain amount of friendly touch from another human being is necessary to help us stay physically regulated. That there are physical symptoms if we don't get enough touch from other people. Positive, affectionate touch. Touch is also one of the primary ways people communicate. It's one of the ways that they express themselves sexually when they select a sex partner. Now, I'm not going into detail, but there are words that can communicate that kind of relationship and those impulses, but the words are not nearly as powerful as touch. There are also negative messages that we convey with touch. Bars tend to hire bouncers, people who can keep order if all the drunk patrons decide to have a fight. Bouncers tend to be very strong, very often very big. And if you are in a bar and someone thinks that you are being disruptive, the bouncer might come and grab you and move you toward the door in a way that tells you you will now be leaving. And they might not say a word to you. They might communicate it with touch. A slightly less, a different example. I don't know if this ever happened when you were a kid, but maybe you were out in public and you weren't behaving right, and your parents wanted to let you know that your behavior needed to change, but without embarrassing everybody. So they'd come up and put a hand, maybe on your shoulder, and just do that. Very, very hard, very, very tightly. Some of my other examples people have been nodding at. Nobody's nodding at that one. It happened to me sometimes. That's a way that touch, and sometimes married couples will do this. If one spouse is saying something that their wife or husband thinks they shouldn't say, they might take their hand and just give it a little squeeze and say, "Don't do that. Don't say that." So touch can send negative messages. Space and touch is the fourth channel. Fifth channel. Environment and artifacts. Environment and artifacts. It is beyond obvious that this is a classroom. How do we know? The projector, the screen, the desks, those tell you what is supposed to happen in this room. Commonly, you can tell the difference between a cheap fast food restaurant that has fluorescent lights like these, has hard plastic seats, and an expensive restaurant that has much softer lighting. The seats are more comfortable. The furniture costs a lot more. A lot of times, the way a space is decorated or laid out tells you what is supposed to happen in there. Now, it's not just decoration. One thing about the arrangement of this room is that there is a focus point. Whoever is here is the person everybody else is supposed to pay attention to. And the seats, which cannot move because the tables are bolted to the floor, all face this direction. I have noticed some of the rooms on the other side of the building that are labeled seminar room, the desks can be moved. They can be put into a circle so everybody can look at each other and have a discussion. We communicate not only with decoration, but the way we build features into the room to tell people how they are to communicate. I've had students over the years get really fascinated with this, and I've directed them to go read up on how airports are designed. The way airports are designed, a lot of people are going to travel through them who can't read the signs and don't know the language. So they build features into the airport that tell you what direction to go, and the features are everywhere. And if you don't know what you're looking for, they're almost invisible. There are patterns in the carpet that tell you, go this direction. All of that, it's not meant to be pretty. It's meant to guide you in how to interact properly. So we say environment and artifacts because little things like the decorations on the shelves, or if you go to a professor's office and you see what kinds of things they've put up in their office, or in your bedroom, the things you put up to make it look like you, to express your personality, so you come home and it doesn't look like a hospital room. Things like that, those artifacts, sometimes they're a way of you communicating to you. You make your room look welcoming. Sometimes they're a way of communicating to other people. If other people come into your room, they learn about you. That's 5 out of 6. Here's the 6th. We communicate with time. And this visual is of a lawyer, an attorney meeting with a client. And when lawyers meet with their clients, they charge by unit of time. They charge by the hour. They break it down so much. Common practice among lawyers is if they spend 6 minutes with you, they call that a tenth. And they have a rate, what they charge you for a tenth. It's like riding in a taxi cab. The way we use our time communicates. Very powerful people commonly have to limit how many other people they meet with face-to-face. Heads of state, the Japanese prime minister, the American president, they have to be tightly scheduled. And people lower down in the government know who's important and who's not by who gets to have regular face-to-face meetings with the powerful person. So the use of time communicates. It's also a way that parents communicate their children's importance, and even a way that friends communicate one another's importance. I had a communication major. I talked to him this weekend, but he graduated 7 years ago, and his senior capstone project was about whether friends from college find time to stay in touch and get together after graduation. Which ones said yes, they did, which ones said no, they didn't, and the differences in attitudes and behaviors that separated them. The friends that you have that are important to you, you make time for. And if you tell someone they're a friend of yours, your best friend, an important friend, but you never have time for them, then it's not very believable. A couple of other issues in the time code. One of them is being prompt versus being late. When you show up to things on time, when you begin and end meetings on time, that communicates that the people who did not have to wait for you, that they were important, that they were a high priority. Now, next week, when we talk about cultural influence, we will talk about clock time and event time cultures. And there are parts of the world where everything runs on event time and people are less likely to interpret it as a negative message if you run late and keep them waiting. But in much of the developed world, they run on clock time. I was told Japan runs very much on clock time. The United States runs mostly on clock time. So starting things promptly and ending things promptly is a message. Finally, just in this past generation, with our digital devices, how quickly you answer a text message, how quickly you answer a message online. Do you leave it unread, or do you answer quickly? That tends to send a message, who's important to you and who is not. So we've defined nonverbal communication, by identifying what researchers say are the channels. As you look through the studies for the article report, you'll see typically these studies focus in on one of these. They're grouped together partly by the kind of behavior or the body part, but often they're grouped behavior by the function, by what do they do. The conversation interaction code, for example. All the nonverbals that clump around having a conversation. When you look at the field report assignment, that will also make use of these. The field report assignment specifically says you and your partner should keep watching people interact until you disagree on an interpretation in at least 3 of those 6. So watch until you see facial expression, and then maybe movement, and then maybe appearance. That would be 3 different channels. Then come back and write up what you saw. I have been talking for almost half of class. We are almost at the 45-minute mark. I am going to rest my vocal cords for a minute or 2 and ask, do you have anything you want to ask me about anything I've said so far? Alrighty. What I am going to do now, there are 7 basic differences between verbal communication and nonverbal communication. And I'm going to talk you through those. Some of these we will not spend a lot of time on. I think I will say what the concept is, and it will be recognizable. Some of them, and one in particular, we're going to invest a little time in. The first basic difference between verbal communication and nonverbal communication is what we sometimes call the linguistic difference. The linguistic difference. Words only make sense when they are arranged properly into sentences using grammar. And that goes for all languages, including sign language. It has a grammar. It's a spatial grammar, not a before and after grammar, but you have to arrange the words properly. Nonverbals are different. In the 1970s, a lot of people tried to make money they did not deserve by writing books about body language. And you can learn to read people like a book. And there are still books being sold and YouTube videos being made that make that claim. And what they sometimes try to do is pair up nonverbals and treat them like a language, as though there is a grammar. There isn't. One thing about nonverbals, you almost always use several at one time. Right now, I'm doing things with my voice. I'm varying my pitch, going up and down with my pitch. I'm elevating my volume, and I'm gesturing, and I'm using my eye contact, and I dressed to teach today instead of being in a t-shirt and shorts. And there are other nonverbals, the design of the classroom. I could probably count 5 or 6 happening at the same time. But you can't say 5 or 6 words at the same time. You arrange them one after another, and they bear on one another like cars in a train. You have to point between the words to know what's being said. Second basic difference between verbal and nonverbal is what we call the continuity. Continuity, or an easier word is continuous. Nonverbals are continuous. Words stop and start. After I said stop and start a moment ago, I didn't say anything for a good 10 seconds, but that whole time I sent nonverbals. I don't think anyone in here has said a word to me since I started talking almost 50 minutes ago, but you've all sent tons of nonverbals. We send nonverbals all the time. That's a basic difference between verbal and nonverbal. Words stop and start. Sentences stop and start. Conversational turns. When you have a conversation, sometimes you talk, sometimes you listen, but your turn at talking stops. But your nonverbals continue the whole time. Third basic difference. This is the one we will spend a bit of time on. It's called the processing difference. The processing difference. Last week I talked about hogwash. I talked about junk science that we keep trying to kill but we can't. I'm about to give you some. Have you ever heard people talk about the left brain and the right brain? And the left brain is where you handle rule-based things and language, and the right brain is where you handle things like visuals and beauty and music and all of that. That's wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. Now there is, the left and the right brain do process differently. But that claim that there's left brain thinking and right brain thinking is a gross oversimplification. Let me take a couple of ways to explain this to you. First, if you have a sheet of math problems in front of you and you look at them and you start to work the math problems, you will, because the experiment has been done, you will have activation in your left brain. And if you, on the other hand, have a painting to look at, you'll have activation in your right brain. But that's only where the activity is when you perceive it, when you first look at it. When you listen to music, upon listening to it, you have activity in your right brain. But in thinking about it, in interpreting it, in making meaning out of it, you have activity all through your brain, both hemispheres. There are functions located all over your brain that you use in any complex operation. Second, depending on how familiar you are with the code, the activation you have in the brain will be different. Now that was gibberish. Let me give you a plain example. Is anyone in here a musician? Plays a musical instrument? Okay. Play a musical instrument? Do you play a musical instrument? Okay. Perfect. Well, but you have in the past. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Who in here does not play a musical instrument at all? Never has. Talented group. Okay, a couple of people in the back row. What instrument do you play? Saxophone. If I played a saxophone solo right now, and especially if it was a song you'd played before, and you could both hear it, you would experience very powerful activation in the left hemisphere. Because you would hear the notes, you would think about the fingering. It wouldn't just be music, it would be a code. But if you've never played saxophone, you'd have right hemisphere activation. Because it's music, it just kind of washes over you. So it depends on the person who is receiving the stimulus where the activation happens. A third thing to think about in debunking left brain and right brain, the far superior way to divide up brain function is to think about the layers of the brain. The layers of the brain. The bottom layer, which we call the primitive cortex, or the reptile or dinosaur brain. That basically handles functions that just about all life forms have. It makes your heart beat. It makes you breathe. You have activation here when you feel afraid. And if you don't think lower life forms can feel afraid, just slap your hand down next to an ant and watch it run for its life. In the reptile brain, we show aggression if we think we have to fight. And so there are nonverbals we show primarily having to do with basic sensations like anger, like fear, where most of the activation is down in the reptile brain. Now on top of that, there's the limbic brain. The limbic brain. A lot of what is processed there, the visual says it's emotion and it's feeling. It is also participation in social relationships. And if you think about wolves in a pack, cows in a herd, there are lots of mammals that experience social relationships. They have hierarchies, they have alphas, they feel jealous, they feel happy when they see another member of their pack. And so a lot of our nonverbals, the activation happens in about the limbic layer. On top of it, there is the neocortex, the cerebrum, and the prefrontal cortex. That's where we do most of the things that make us different as humans from animals. We've mentioned already today humor and sarcasm. There has never been a sarcastic dog. It takes a human being to experience and to express some things that are very subtle. So those nonverbals get processed in the neocortex. So if you want to divide up your brain into regions that handle verbal and nonverbal, don't make the mistake of saying, well, the verbals are on the left hemisphere, the nonverbals are in the right hemisphere. And when you hear the occasional clumsy researcher who says so, don't believe it. But you could categorize basic functions in the bottom layer, emotional and social in the limbic, which, by the way, it's fair to say, this is where most nonverbals are governed, in the limbic layer. And most verbal communication involves activation in the neocortex. But there are nonverbals that get managed here, and we do sometimes choose a word out of emotion or out of feeling a social need, that there's something we want to do socially in a relationship. And we would work that out in the limbic layer. All right. We've been through 3 of the differences. Here's the 4th. We sometimes call it we often call it the use difference. What do we use them for? What do we use them for? One of the basic ideas in the study of interpersonal communication is that every time you communicate with another human being, you deliver content, but you also, in some way, show or strengthen what relationship you have with them. So if you're in your workplace talking to a co-worker, you might be very businesslike. They might ask you what time it is. You might tell them what time it is very calmly, without any affection. They asked for information. You gave it to them. On the other hand, your small child, your adorable little toddler child, might ask you what time it is. And in answering them, you might be affectionate. You might tell them very slowly. You tell them differently from how you would tell a coworker. So we convey content, and we also show and strengthen the relationship. This distinction, the use distinction, most of the time to convey content, we use words. If you're going to teach a math lesson, you are primarily going to explain whatever's behind the screen here that the previous instructor did not erase. You're going to do that with words. It's very hard to teach a math lesson non-verbally. I'm not sure it can be done. On the other hand, if you want to show someone in your family how much you value them, a point we've made already today, you can do it with words. You can do it more powerfully with your face, with your voice, and with your touch. Okay, the fifth distinction of 7 is the distinction of directness. How direct? Words are more direct than nonverbals. Nonverbals almost always have multiple possible meanings. Words can have multiple meanings, but when you put a word on something, you are locking it down. You didn't choose any other word. So, verbal communication tends to be more direct. If you've ever found someone attractive and you've flirted with them, flirting, I don't know if that will translate. If you have with your nonverbals, tried to be noticeable to them so they'll notice how attractive you are. If you've ever done that, you could be very subtle, and if they show that they're not interested, you didn't embarrass yourself. You can just go on with your day. But if you walk up to someone and say, "I find you attractive," and they aren't interested, well, can't really pretend you didn't do it. All right. Sixth one, the complexity distinction, the complexity difference. It takes a human being who I would say is at least several years old to be able to use language. Animals do not use language. There are gorillas who've been taught to use sign language, but even that is controversial. There is no instance yet of a clear-cut, complex sentence from a gorilla. Animals communicate. They do it non-verbally. Babies communicate. They do it non-verbally. I'll give you a quick example of this in case any of you ever plan to have children. A major turning point in a baby's life that is not appreciated enough is a gesture. We call this, in the study of gestures, a deictic. The simple word for it is the baby points at something. And the baby points, and you, the grown-up person, look where they point. They will go crazy with joy over that because they did that. They directed your attention, and they feel so powerful when they do that. That's why babies who aren't yet talking point to so many things. They love making you look where they point. All that to say, Nonverbal communication is the way less complicated life forms communicate. More complicated life forms, or humans of a certain level of maturity, use language. Nobody else does. So language is associated with greater complexity. The seventh and final difference is the trust difference. The trust difference. This one's real simple. When your words say one thing and your nonverbals contradict them, people believe the nonverbals. If your words say one thing and your nonverbals say the opposite, or something that contradicts your words, people believe the nonverbals. So if I walk in here like this, and one of you says, "Why are you so angry?" I say, "I'm not angry!" Am I angry? But my words were, "I'm not angry." But you can hear from my nonverbals, so you don't believe my words. We will eventually get to talking about detecting deception, telling that people are lying by watching their nonverbals. Now, I think I've already warned you. The research says we are not accurate. But this difference is not about accuracy, it's about what people believe. And they will observe your nonverbals, or you might observe other people's nonverbals, and if you think they contradict what they say, we just about always choose the nonverbal to believe. I think I can only give you one example that goes the other way, and it might encourage you a little bit. I'm at the point in my career where I often am asked to be on a committee that interviews someone who wants to be hired. So I've been in a lot of job interviews where I'm the one asking the questions. And someone who applied for the job will come in and answer the questions, and they'll be talking about how they're qualified to do the job, they think they can do the job, and every nonverbal they've got makes it look like they're nervous. This is meant to reassure you, if that ever happens to you. You walk out the door closes, and we say to each other, "Well, they look nervous, but it's a job interview. Of course they look nervous." That's one where we listen to the words and we don't let the nonverbals change our minds. I'm not saying that always happens, but it has been my experience. Okay, 7 differences between verbal and nonverbal. Bringing us then, with 25-ish minutes left, to the last 2 things that I wanted for us to have time to talk about today. The title of today's class included vocabulary, theoretical framework, and skill definitions. The theoretical framework. If any of you have had a basic communication studies class ever, I've recently learned those exist here, then you may have encountered this before, in which case it will be review. This is the model of communication. The model of communication. You will notice nowhere in it is there any mention of words, because it includes nonverbal communication as easily as verbal. When communication happens, it begins with a sender. A sender. Right now, in our communication, I am the sender. I am sending messages. Now, I just gave it away. The second element of the model is a message. I am sending messages. Now, if I'm sending, what do you think we need on the other end of the model? Anybody? Very good. The next element is the receiver. A sender sends a message to a receiver. This model, which has 2 more elements before it's complete, was dreamed up by a professor of mathematics named Claude Shannon in the 1940s. He was employed by the telephone company to try to help them analyze talk on the telephone so they could improve it. And he said the very basics are a sender sending a message to a receiver through a channel. We've already mentioned channels today. We identified 6 channels of nonverbal communication. Right now, primarily, I'm communicating with you through the audio channel. Because I'm teaching class, like the math professor on the slide, I'm using words primarily. But I am supporting the audio channel with the visual channel. Visuals on the screen, my gestures. The message travels through a channel to the receiver. On its way through the channel, it is interfered with by noise. Noise is any kind of energy that stops or at least interferes with the message reaching its destination. So, if I stand up here and I do this while I'm talking and it makes it hard for you to hear me, that was obviously noise, the simplest definition. Noise could also be psychological. I might use an example that brings up for you a painful memory. You might pay attention to that memory and find it hard to concentrate on me. Noise can be in the words themselves. Near the start of class, I talked about, we ran a survey of your major histocompatibility complex and we titrated and found 5 parts per million. And I'm using all that gibberish, all that technical language, those words you've never learned. That's a form of noise. So the message travels through the channel to the receiver, interfered with by the noise, and the receiver sends feedback. The reason that your grandparents are so loud when they talk on cell phones is because they're used to talking into an old landline where they could hear their own voice in the earpiece. Now on a cell phone, when they can't hear that, they don't know if they're loud enough, so they yell just to be safe. But a generation that grew up with cell phones knows you don't have to yell. But the feedback was built into the telephone system. Now, right now, you're giving me feedback. You are looking at me. You sometimes nod. You sometimes laugh at my silly attempts at humor. All of that is feedback. We took the Shannon model of communication, and we in the communication field have challenged it a couple of ways. Here's the first. It is an outdated idea to say there's a sender and then you give feedback. Instead, what we now say is there are communicators on both ends. I'm not the sender, you're not the receiver. I'm a communicator, you're a communicator. Let me give you an example. If you have ever held a baby, maybe someone in your family has a niece or a nephew who's a baby, and the baby is crying and fussing, and you're doing everything you can think of. You're bouncing this baby, you're making silly faces, and you do something with your face, and the baby stops crying. What do you then do? You do that face as hard as you can to keep the baby no longer crying. Here's the question. Did you make the baby stop crying, or did the baby make you make the face? And the answer is, you both negotiated that communication. And that's what's happening right now with the 3 or 4 heads around the room that nodded, that said to me, for part of the class, that clicked. Here's a challenge I will give to you informally. Years ago, I used to give it as an assignment. Pick the most boring class you have with the teacher who puts you to sleep. Get 3 or 4 of your friends together, and for a couple of class meetings, all of you have to put on the best acting performance you can that teacher is fascinating. Sit there and show how interested you are in every word that teacher says. I would give my students that assignment, And I would say, come back and tell me what happened. And they said, that teacher got so much better. The teacher was energetic. The teacher started to wake up. The teacher seemed to be enjoying the class. Yes, that's because you were communicating with them the whole time. And all those class meetings when they were boring, you were showing them they were boring. And that's part of the reason they were boring. So, communication is happening on both ends. This idea will come up a lot in this class because the nonverbals we send one another, we regulate what the other person in the conversation experiences or perceives. The final change we made was to say, it depends on context. It depends on context. It depends on where you are, what you're doing, who you are expected to be. You do not communicate the same way at work as you do with your friends. You don't communicate the same way with your friends as with your family. And I'm not going to give you the long editorial on this today, just the short one. There are lots of things we come up with in the field of psychology. One popular one lately is, I'm an introvert or I'm an extrovert. No, you're not. Whichever one you've labeled yourself, and lately it's been cool to say you're an introvert, no, you're not. You're an ambivert, which is to say, in some contexts, you look like an introvert. And in others, you function as an extrovert. Context is everything. In the communication field, for years we talked about listening styles and said that people have a listening style. And we lately had to take all that research and throw it in the trash because people have a different listening style depending on the context, where they are and who they are being. Context is everything. I'll give you one last example before I get off this. I have a thing I do in my Intro to Communication class where there's an online gizmo where you get to choose 5 words that describe you from off a list. And then you send that list to other people. And they pick the 5 words that they think describe you, and you see how much overlap there is. I picked my 5 words 20 years ago, and I've sent mine to my students all that time. They have, at one time or another, picked 4 of the 5. I'll give you the one that not one student has ever picked for me. I picked the word quiet. I think I'm quiet. But students only ever see this version of me. And here I'm not quiet. So where you are and what you're doing, you give people an impression, but you move to a different context, and that changes. All right. The final thing for us to talk about. We have about 15 minutes. That I think will be more than enough time. You may get the last 5 or 10 minutes back. These are the nonverbal communication skills. There are 2 categories. Sending skills. So all these nonverbals, sending the messages out. And then receiving skills. Sending skills and receiving skills. Now I know I just said, according to the model, there are not senders and receivers. There are communicators on both sides. But you do send. When you nod your heads, you sent me a message. And when I talk to you, I'm sending you a message. The model is just saying we do it at the same time. Sending skills, receiving skills. These can be divided into simple and complex. Simple and complex. Now, I don't want you to think simple means easy. Simple sending skills, simple receiving skills are not easy skills. Simple means we develop them at a younger age. It means they tend to involve just one channel, not several, and they involve less critical thinking. Complex skills, whether sending or receiving, we develop later. They involve multiple channels at the same time, and they involve more critical thinking. So, simple sending skills. There are two of them. There are the unplanned messages that you send. The unplanned, another word is spontaneous, but that just means not planned. When people get old, they have gray hair. They don't choose to have gray hair, and it's only in one channel, but it sends the message of their age. When you have an emotion that you cannot hold back, when you find something funny and you know you're not supposed to laugh, but it just escapes you, the laugh gets out of you. Or when you're having a terrible day and you think you're about to cry and you don't want to cry, but then you just lose it. Emotion that you lose control of is an example of sending a message that is not planned. Babies send a lot of messages that they didn't plan. They don't cry because they've figured out crying is adult language for please come feed me. They cry because it feels painful to have an empty stomach when you're a baby. And adults interpret that, and they know that's a hungry cry, and then they feed their baby. The second simple sending skill is deliberate sending. Deliberate sending. If you have a job interview, or if you have a date, the clothing you wear, that you pick out and wear, you will try very hard to send a message. For the date, that you are good looking. For the job interview, that you are professional and trustworthy. So that's deliberate. Another category of deliberate messages, when we gesture. Gestures tend to be deliberate. There are things that people do that they're not aware that they do. There are fidgets. This pen is too heavy for me to demonstrate, but this is a fidget of mine that's been a habit for years. And there we go. And I do that not even noticing I'm doing it. That's not deliberate sending. But babies having their fun pointing and making adults look where they pointed, that's deliberate. We learned that from a very young age, and it uses one channel. Complex sending. Complex sending. This mostly involves inhibiting our impulses. That was gibberish. Let me try it again. We have things we want to do, but we hold back from doing them because we know we shouldn't. Those are complex sending skills. Let me give you a couple of examples. One of them we call adapting. Adapting. You tune your nonverbals to the person you're talking to. I want you to think for a minute, who in your life are you the most careful about talking to? You might have a family member, a grandparent, a sister or brother, where you have to be very careful because if you say the wrong thing, they're going to get unhappy with you. So you think very carefully not only about what to say, but about how to say it. A lot of people are that way around small children. They might get upset with their small children, but they take a breath and they speak calmly because if they show how upset they are, the child might be scared. So you tune by holding back and not showing exactly what you want to show. The second complex sending skill we call coordinating. Coordinating. That's where you try to make all your nonverbals match your verbal content. If you've ever been in a situation where you want to be friendly, where your job or your role is to welcome people who are new, and you know that they'll feel nervous, maybe they're new here to campus, and you're trying to welcome new students, you try to have a friendly tone of voice, a friendly face. You try to, if you give them a tour, and you're leading them around the campus, showing them where things are, as you walk, you keep turning toward them. All your nonverbals are put in service to them and to the message, I'm glad you're here. So those are complex sending skills. Now, as far as receiving, there are, again, simple skills. There are two of them. One of them we call attunement. Attunement, that's an obscure enough word that I realize my predecessor left the board completely covered, but that one I'm putting on the board. Attunement, even small children can tell, sorry about it sloping downhill, I ran out of board. Small children can tell if you're sad, and they'll come and offer you their toy because they can pick up on how you feel. Along with attunement, there is what we call deciphering. Deciphering. At a very young age, children will learn that a smile means that you're happy, that a frown means that you're angry. They learn simple messages like that. Complex receiving skills. There are two of these. One is putting messages into their context. Putting messages into their context. Let us imagine, let's see. This happens occasionally back in the United States. I have not seen you do it, but let's imagine these two students right here were having a whispered conversation in the middle of class while I'm up here trying to teach class. They do that sometimes back in the United States, and this is what I usually do. I just stand there and stare at them until they stop. Now, if I stare at someone in the middle of class while they're having a conversation, in that context, the message is, what you're doing is not okay, please stop. Back in the United States, I also don't own a car. So I walk everywhere I go. Very commonly, I will come to a corner where a car is about to pull out of a parking lot. And what I always do is I look at the driver's side window of the car and do this. Because when you lock eye contact with another person, it's almost instinct for them to lock eye contact with you. If you've ever been out somewhere and thought, what is going on, and then realized someone was staring at you, that's the instinct I'm going for. In the United States, a lot of people, when they drive, are distracted. They play on their phone. So I stare at them to get them to look at me so they won't run over me. In the middle of class, if I stare at someone, I'm saying, please stop talking. If I'm walking around town and I stare at someone, it's, please notice me and don't run over me. So it's about, can you take the nonverbal and can you, in context, see what it means? I don't usually talk at this pitch. If you come to my office for my office hours, you will, for the first time ever, hear me talk like this. This is my conversational speaking voice. But in here, I take my pitch up here because it carries more easily in a classroom. If you come to my office and I talk like this, I don't know what's going on. I'm having a nervous breakdown. So, tell what they are in context. Oops. The last of the complex receiving skills, we call integrating. Integrating. You look at lots of different nonverbal cues and can you add them up? Can you look at lots of nonverbals that one person is sending and can you accurately figure out what's happening? Now, sometimes it's easy. Sometimes they're smiling and they're bouncing up and down in the chair and everything about them says happy. And it's easy. They're happy. Sometimes, though, maybe they look tired. Maybe they're fidgeting. Maybe I speak to them and they snap at me in an angry voice. And if I just take one nonverbal, the angry voice, I think they're mad at me, they don't like me, what did I do? But if I look at all of it, they look tired, they're fidgeting, they speak to me suddenly in an angry voice. I might say, they are having a really bad day, and it's not about me at all. I happen to catch them at a moment where they're really, really struggling, and they snapped at me, and they probably didn't mean to. And I'm not going to take offense, and I'm not going to assume they hate me. If I can, I'm going to try to help them. That's what you get when you take their nonverbals and you integrate several of them that may not all be suggesting the same feeling. So, to wrap it up, with about 3 minutes left in class, simple skills, complex skills, sending skills, receiving skills. There are simple sending and simple receiving. There are complex sending and complex receiving. As we in this class go through channel after channel, we're going to try to get you watching for individual cues and also how they blend together to strengthen your skills in sending and in receiving, both simple and complicated. And we defined our terms. We introduced the model of communication. I think we did a good day's work. If you want to ask me a question, you have about 2 minutes about where the class is going from here, the assignments, anything. Yes, please. Previews. Got it. So, this is something over my other university. For the first couple of weeks, they would say, what do we need to do to be ready for next week? Which is a good question. In this class, there's no homework week to week. There are only 2 assignments, the field report and the article report. You can't really start either one till you have a partner. So my whole talk at the beginning about have a look at the articles and start making a list of which ones you want. You can do that now, and that will pay off later. But to be ready for next week, no. One other thing I will mention, it's in Moodle, if I haven't been timed out already. Some people say they learn better by having something to read. And I have in here a chapter from an open source textbook where you can read discussion of a lot of the same topics. If that helps you, please take advantage of it. If it wouldn't help you, none of it's assigned. You're not going to be tested over it. Use it if it helps. Ignore it if it doesn't. Very good question. Anyone else have one? I think the chime is going to go off in a minute. Okay, I'm going to kill the recording. And actually, there it goes. And I will see you next week.